The bell of St. Mary's Church tolled gently on that Sunday morning, calling the faithful to the first Mass of the day. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, and its soft hues painted the sky of Chicago with shades of pink and orange. "Father," Michael adjusted his cassock in front of the sacristy mirror, observing the marks of time on his face. At 65, he still maintained the same zeal and dedication as when he had taken over the parish 3 decades ago. Among the first parishioners to arrive was Edward Thompson, a successful real estate businessman known as much for his fortune as for his reclusiveness. At 50, he rarely attended public events, preferring the seclusion of his mansion in the Beverly Hills neighborhood. His presence at church that Sunday was an exception, the result of the insistence of Mrs. Clara, his housekeeper of over 20 years. "You need to get out more, Mr. Edward," she had said the night before, with that maternal tone only she could muster. "Staying locked up in that house isn't good for anyone's soul." Edward chose a discreet spot in the back pews of the church, observing the surroundings with a mix of discomfort and curiosity. The temple was beginning to fill with people from different social classes, all united by the same faith. Mrs. Carmen, the neighborhood seamstress, sat a few rows ahead, her calloused hands firmly clutching her rosary. Beside her, Helen Smith, a municipal schoolteacher, organized the hymnals with her usual dedication. The Mass began promptly at 7 o'clock, with the choir singing the first hymns. The gentle aroma of incense filled the air, mingling with the light streaming through the stained glass windows, creating an atmosphere of serenity and contemplation. Father Michael, with his deep and calm voice, began the celebration when the unexpected happened. The heavy doors of the church opened with a loud bang that echoed through the entire nave, causing everyone present to turn around in alarm. A child, who appeared to be no more than 10 years old, emerged, breathless. His simple, worn-out clothes contrasted sharply with the solemnity of the surroundings. His dark, disheveled hair framed a face marked by an inexplicable urgency. The boy, ignoring the surprised glances and murmurs of disapproval, strode down the central aisle with determined steps. In his hands, he clutched a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded so many times that its creases looked like scars on the document. His large, restless eyes scanned the faces of those present, as if desperately searching for something or someone. Edward felt a sudden unease as he watched the scene. There was something familiar about that boy, something that struck a deep chord in his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. It was as if an old photograph was beginning to develop in his mind, but it remained too blurry to be recognized. The silence that followed was deafening. Father Michael, with his years of experience handling all sorts of situations, tried to maintain the congregation's calm. "My brothers and sisters, let us remain composed," his voice echoed through the space. But before he could say anything more, the boy had already turned and was running toward the exit, leaving behind only the echo of his footsteps and a lingering sense of mystery in the air. Edward felt an inexplicable urge. Something about that scene called to him, as if an invisible thread were pulling him toward that mystery. Without a second thought, he rose from his seat and followed the boy, ignoring the surprised glances of the other parishioners. Mrs. Clara, who had been watching everything from afar, made the sign of the cross, murmuring a prayer for her employer. The businessman walked through the church doors, feeling the cool morning air on his face. His eyes quickly searched for the boy, spotting him turning a corner a few blocks ahead. The chase would take him down paths he had never imagined traversing, through a side of the city he had long chosen to ignore. As he ran, Edward felt his heart pounding harder, not just from the physical exertion, but from the growing sense that he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. The yellowed paper in the boy's hands, his urgent expression, that familiar feeling of recognition, it all formed a puzzle he needed to solve. The pursuit led Edward through increasingly narrow and unfamiliar streets. The neighborhood of Brooklyn, with its old houses and historic buildings, revealed itself as a labyrinth of intertwined stories and lives. The boy, agile as a cat, slipped through alleys and side streets with the familiarity of someone who knew every stone on the path. Edward, even breathless, refused to give up following him. The streets they passed through were a stark contrast to the sterile, controlled environment he was accustomed to. Clotheslines stretched between windows displayed colorful garments dancing in the wind. The scent of fresh coffee and freshly baked bread wafted from the local bakeries. Women leaned out of their windows chatting, pausing their conversations to observe this unusual chase. "Hey, kid," Edward tried to call out, his voice betraying the exhaustion from the run. "Wait, I just want to talk." But the boy didn't. Slow down. On the contrary, he seemed even more determined in his escape. He turned another corner, this time entering a dead-end street that led to an old abandoned mansion. The building, an early 20th century construction, displayed the decay of time and neglect. Its broken windows looked like empty eyes watching. The city and the peeling paint on its walls told silent stories of past glories. The boy stopped in front of the rusted iron gate, turning for the first time to face Edward. His large, expressive eyes conveyed a mix of fear and anticipation. Without a word, he pushed the gate, which yielded with an ominous creak, and stepped into the abandoned garden. Edward hesitated for a moment. Years of corporate life had taught him to calculate risks, to never act on impulse. But something about this situation defied business logic. It was as if a greater force was pulling him into that mystery. With a deep sigh, he stepped through the gate. The garden, once undoubtedly majestic, was now a tangle of wild vegetation. Vines had taken over the walls, and what was once a stone path was almost entirely covered by overgrown weeds. In the center, an old fountain still held its structure, though it had long since seen a drop of water. The boy climbed the steps to the porch and, with surprising familiarity, pushed open the main door. Edward followed him, stepping into a space that seemed frozen in time. Sunlight lazily filtered through the cracks of the dusty windows, revealing furniture draped in white sheets and walls adorned with framed paintings. "Why did you bring me here?" Edward asked, his voice echoing through the empty room. The boy, still silent, walked over to a side table and lit a candlestick resting there. The flickering flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, bringing life to the old photographs hanging there. With deliberate movements, the boy began removing the sheets covering the furniture, revealing a room that seemed to have been abandoned in haste. On one of the walls, a particular portrait caught Edward's attention. It was a black and white photograph of a young woman with a gentle smile and eyes that seemed to pierce through time. Beside her, a small child smiled at the camera. The resemblance between that child in the photo and the boy standing before him was striking. "Did you know her?" asked the boy, speaking for the first time. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. Edward approached the photograph, feeling his heart race. The woman in the photo, there was something familiar about her, something that made his past knock on the door of his memory with a disconcerting urgency. Long-buried memories began to surface, like bubbles rising to the top of a deep lake. The yellowed paper the boy was carrying was then extended toward him. It was a letter dated 5 years ago. The handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, as if it had been written with great effort. Edward took the document with trembling, hands feeling the weight of the history those pages carried. "My mother said you would know what to do," said the boy, his voice now firmer. "She said you were the only person who could understand." The boy's words echoed through the empty room, laden with a meaning Edward did not yet fully grasp. But as his eyes scanned the first lines of the letter, a sense of recognition began to take hold of him. It was as if each word were a key, unlocking long-closed doors in his memory. The letter in Edward's hands began with words that made his world spin. "Dear Edward, if you are reading this letter, it means the time of truth has finally come." The elegant handwriting belonged to Helen Mendelssohn, a woman he had met 15 years ago during a time that seemed to belong to another life. As he read, fragments of memory began to fit together like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle. Helen had been one of the coordinators of the social project his company sponsored in the Brooklyn area, an extraordinary woman who dedicated her life to helping underprivileged children, running a small school in her own home. "I know you must be surprised by all of this," the letter continued, "but I need you to understand that every decision I made was with everyone's best interest in mind. Lucas, the boy now standing before you, carries a story that is also yours, even if you don't know it yet." Edward lifted his eyes from the paper and looked at the boy. Lucas, who waited patiently, seated in an old armchair. His eyes, Edward, now noticed more carefully, had a familiar shade of brown, the same one he saw every morning in the mirror. "Keep reading," Lucas urged, his voice barely masking his anxiety. The letter went on to reveal a plot Edward could never have imagined. Helen spoke of her younger sister, Clara Marie, who had worked as a secretary in Edward's company 15 years ago. A young woman full of dreams and determination, who ended up falling in love with her boss during the months she worked closely with him. "Clara Marie never had the courage to tell you about the pregnancy," Helen revealed in the following pages. "When she found out she was expecting Lucas, she knew you were about to marry Beatrice, the daughter of your biggest investor. A marriage that, as you yourself said, was crucial for the company's future." Edward felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. He remembered Clara Marie. Of course he remembered her. She had abruptly resigned, leaving only a note saying she needed to take care of family matters in another state. He had been intrigued at the time, but soon the routine and pressures of business took over his thoughts. The marriage to Beatrice, mentioned in the letter, never actually happened. The bride left him at the altar, running off with an old boyfriend 2 weeks before the ceremony. The scandal nearly ruined his business, and since then Edward had retreated into a shell of solitude and work. "Clara Marie never wanted to disrupt your life," Helen continued. "She raised Lucas alone, with all the love in the world, working as a teacher at my little school. But 3 years ago, when she discovered her illness, she began to worry about the boy's future." Lucas stood up and walked over to a shelf where he retrieved a photo album. As he opened it, he showed pictures of a young, smiling woman. The photo album in Lucas's hands told a silent story of love and sacrifice. Edward looked at each image with a mix of fascination and guilt, recognizing in Clara Marie's features the same determination he had admired years ago. The photos showed happy moments, Lucas as a baby in her arms, his first steps, simple but joyful birthdays, sunny days in the park. "She always talked about you," Lucas said, breaking the heavy silence that had settled in the room. "Not with anger or sadness. She said you were a good man, but that sometimes good people lose their way too." Edward felt his hands tremble as he turned another page of the album. There was a photo that struck him like lightning. Clara Marie next to Helen, both smiling, in front of the small school where they worked. The date in the corner of the photograph indicated it had been taken just a few months earlier. "Your Aunt Helen," Edward began, but his voice faltered. "Where is she now?" Lucas closed the album carefully, as if those memories were made of glass. "Aunt Helen traveled to Portugal 2 weeks ago. She needed to go take care of our grandmother, who is very ill. Before leaving, she gave me the letter and said it was time for you to know the truth." The boy's words carried a maturity beyond his years. Edward realized that this child had grown up carrying a secret too heavy for his age, holding on to a truth that could change everything. "Why now?" Edward asked, more to himself than to Lucas. "Why did Helen choose this moment?" "Because she didn't want me to be alone," Lucas replied, his voice breaking for the first time since they had arrived at that house. "After Mom passed away, Aunt Helen took care of me. But now she needs to stay in Portugal for a long time, maybe years. She said you were my only true family." The weight of that revelation hit Edward with full force. His entire world, built on the solid foundations of work and chosen solitude, was being shaken by this unexpected encounter on a Sunday morning. The walls he had built around himself, year after year, were beginning to show cracks. Mrs. Clara, his loyal housekeeper, always said his life was too empty for a man who had so much. "You need something more than numbers and contracts, Mr. Edward," she would repeat with her simple wisdom. Now, standing before him, was someone who represented far more than all his material possessions. "Lucas," Edward called, trying to find the right words. Would you like to tell me more about your mother?" The boy's face lit up with a shy smile, the first since they had met. "She loved to sing," he began, his eyes sparkling with memories. "Every night before bed, she would sing a different song. She said each song had a special story." As Lucas spoke, Edward noticed other details in the room that had previously gone unnoticed. An old guitar rested in a corner, covered by a thin layer of dust. Handwritten sheet music was scattered on a small table, the delicate handwriting of Clara Marie, immortalized on the lined paper. She used to teach music at Aunt Helen's little school, Lucas continued. Sometimes on weekends she would organize small recitals with the students. Everyone from the neighborhood would come to watch. It was like one big family. The word family echoed in Edward's mind. For years he had convinced himself that he didn't need it, that his life was complete with his business empire and his self-imposed solitude. But there in that room full of memories, something began to shift within him. "Lucas," Edward said, his voice finding a firmness he didn't know he had, "I think we need to talk about the future. About your future. About our future." Back at his mansion in Beverly Hills, Edward found Mrs. Clara waiting anxiously at the door, her face a mix of worry and curiosity. Upon seeing Lucas by his side, the housekeeper's eyes widened, but something in her gaze suggested she had been expecting a change in her employer's life for a long time. "Mrs. Clara," Edward began, his voice carrying an emotion she had never heard before, "this is Lucas. He's going to stay with us for a while." The housekeeper looked deeply into the boy's eyes, and with that intuition only people with an old soul possess, immediately recognized the resemblance. Without saying a word, she offered a warm smile and extended her hand to Lucas. "Come, my child, you must be hungry. I still have that warm cornbread cake I just took out of the oven." Lucas, still shy, followed Mrs. Clara to the kitchen, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts in the living room. The businessman glanced at the picture frames on the mantel. All photos of business achievements, awards, and recognitions. No personal memories, no genuine smiles. For the first time, he felt the emptiness of that enormous house. In the kitchen, the aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the soft laughter of Lucas and Mrs. Clara. The housekeeper was already telling stories about the house and its gardens while serving the boy a generous slice of cake. It was as if a breath of life had entered that mansion, which for so long had merely existed without truly living. "The master always loved this cornbread cake," Mrs. Clara remarked when Edward entered the kitchen. "Lucas also loved it. Must be a family thing." The word family made Edward pause for a moment. He looked at Lucas, who was savoring the cake with evident pleasure, and felt something stir within him. It wasn't just the weight of responsibility, it was something deeper, more genuine. "Lucas," Edward called, sitting down at the kitchen table. "Tomorrow we need to sort out a few things. Your school enrollment, documents. But first I want you to tell me more about yourself, about what you like to do, your dreams." The boy wiped the cake crumbs from his mouth with a napkin, a gesture that strongly reminded him of Clara Marie, and began to speak. His passion for music, inherited from his mother, shone in his eyes as he talked about the guitar lessons he had at his little school. He spoke about his dream of one day playing in an orchestra, of creating his own music. "Mom used to say that music has the power to bring people together," Lucas said, his soft voice carrying the wisdom of his mother's words. "That when we play together, our hearts beat in the same rhythm." Edward felt his eyes well up. He remembered a young Clara Marie, years ago, humming softly as she organized documents in her office. At the time, it irritated him. Now the memory brought a smile to his lips. "You know, Lucas," said Edward, "we have a piano in this house. It was my mother's. It's been closed for years, but maybe it's time to let the music return." Mrs. Clara, who was silently observing the scene, discreetly wiped away a tear. In her 40 years of service in that house, she had never seen her employer speak of his mother's piano. The instrument, covered by a white cloth in the music room, was like a monument to the past that Edward tried to forget. Can I see the piano?" asked Lucas, his eyes shining with anticipation. Edward stood up and, with a gesture, invited the boy to follow him. They crossed the main hallway, passing walls decorated with expensive but soulless works of art, until they reached a door that hadn't been opened in years. The scent of old wood and stored memories filled their nostrils as Edward turned the doorknob. The music room was a silent testament to happier times. The grand piano, still majestic under its protective cover, stood at the center of the room. On the walls, old photographs showed an elegant woman seated at the piano, her gentle smile frozen in time. Edward's mother. With reverential care, Edward removed the white cloth that covered the piano. A cloud of dust danced in the air, illuminated by the rays of sunlight streaming through the gaps in the heavy curtains. The instrument, a classic Steinway, retained its elegance even after years of neglect. Lucas approached with wide-eyed wonder, his fingers hovering over the yellowed keys, not daring to touch them. "It was my mother's most treasured possession," Edward explained, his voice heavy with emotion. "She used to give piano lessons here at home. On Sunday afternoons, this room would be filled with music and laughter." Mrs. Clara, who had followed them silently, began to open the heavy velvet curtains. Morning light flooded the room, revealing details previously hidden in the shadows. Old sheet music neatly arranged on wooden shelves, a dusty metronome on a small table, photographs in tarnished silver frames. "The piano needs tuning," Edward remarked, pressing a key that produced a discordant sound. "It's been so long." "Can I play something?" Lucas asked timidly. "Even if it's out of tune?" Edward nodded, and the boy sat on the piano bench. His small fingers touched the keys gently, producing the first chords of a simple yet beautiful melody. It was Asa Branca, the same song Clara Marie used to sing in her classes. The melody, even with a few off-key notes, filled the room with a life that had long been forgotten. Edward closed his eyes, letting himself be carried away by the music. For a moment he could feel his mother's presence there. He could see Clara Marie smiling. He could sense that the house was finally regaining its soul. "How beautiful, my son!" exclaimed Mrs. Clara, moved. "You play so well." Lucas smiled, his cheeks flushing at the compliment. "Mom taught me. She said music is like magic, it can turn any place into a home." Those words struck Edward deeply. How long had it been since that mansion had ceased to be a home? When exactly had he allowed silence to take over everything, smothering happy memories under layers and layers of loneliness? "I'll call the tuner tomorrow," Edward decided, "and we can look for a piano teacher for you, if you want to keep learning." Lucas's eyes sparkled, but soon a shadow of concern crossed his face. "But what about the guitar? Can I keep taking lessons at Aunt Helen's little school?" The question caught Edward off guard. It was true. The little school in Brooklyn, the music lessons, Lucas's friends. All of that was part of the boy's life. A life very different from the one he led in his mansion in Beverly Hills. "Of course you can," Edward replied after a moment of reflection. "I don't want you to stop doing the things you love. We'll find a way to make it all work." At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was his assistant reminding him of the important meeting he had in half an hour with foreign investors. The reality of the outside world intruded on that magical moment, bringing with it new challenges. "I need to go to work," Edward said, checking his watch, "but I'll be back for lunch. Mrs. Clara, can you show Lucas the guest room? The one with the garden view?" "Don't worry, Mr. Edward," replied the housekeeper with a knowing smile. "I'll take care of everything so the boy feels at home." As he prepared to leave, Edward realized he would have to do much more than simply offer Lucas a roof over his head. He would need to reorganize his life, his schedule, his priorities. The boy's presence demanded a complete transformation in his way of living. In his company's office, during the meeting with investors, Edward found himself repeatedly thinking about the melody Lucas had played. Amid numbers and charts, his mind wandered to the music room, to the piano that had come back to life, to the memories that were beginning to awaken. "Mr. Thompson," called one of the investors, noticing his distraction. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, sorry," Edward replied, adjusting himself in his chair. "Actually, things are better than they've been in a long time." A week had passed since Lucas arrived at the Thompson mansion. The mornings, once quiet and methodical, were now filled with the sound of hurried footsteps and lively conversations during breakfast. Edward had rearranged his schedule, arriving later at the office so he could take the boy to school. That Monday morning, as he drove his Mercedes through the city, Edward watched Lucas in the rearview mirror. The boy looked out the window, clutching the guitar that Mrs. Clara had fetched from the old house in Brooklyn. They were on their way to the little school where Clara Marie had worked, and where Lucas still took his music lessons. "Are you sure?" "Do you want to keep studying there?" asked Edward, trying to sound casual. "We could look for a school that's closer to home." Lucas turned his eyes to his father, a wisdom beyond his years reflected in his gaze. "The little school is special, Dad. Everyone there is like family. And there's the Music for Everyone project that Mum helped create." The word "Dad" still sent a shiver down Edward's spine. Lucas had started using it naturally 2 days ago during dinner, catching him completely off guard. It was a word that carried so much weight, so much responsibility, yet somehow it felt perfectly right. When they arrived at the little school, they were greeted by Mrs. Constance, a grey-haired black woman who was the current director. Her eyes widened as she saw Edward Thompson, the famous businessman, stepping out of his imported car in front of the modest establishment. "Welcome, Mr. Thompson," she said with a gentle smile. "Helen told me you were coming. Lucas filled us in on the news." The boy ran to hug the principal, while other children began to arrive, some on foot, others by bus. The contrast between the two worlds was evident. On one side, the businessman in his Italian suit, on the other, the welcoming simplicity of the Brooklyn community. "Mrs. Constance," Edward began, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture, "I'd like to learn more about the music project Clara Marie developed here." The principal smiled, her eyes shining with memories. "Come with me. I'll show you our music room." Clara Marie transformed this place with her love for art. She secured donated instruments, organized performances, and brought new life to these old walls. As they walked through the school's hallways, Edward noticed the colorful posters on the walls, the children's drawings, and the photographs of musical performances. In several of them, he recognized Clara Marie, always smiling, always surrounded by students. In one particular photo, she appeared pregnant, conducting a small children's choir. "She never let anything stop her from pursuing her dreams," Mrs. Constance remarked, noticing Edward's gaze on the photograph. "Even when things got tough, she stayed strong and dedicated. The Music for All project was her greatest legacy." In the music room, various instruments, some new, others visibly used but well cared for, were lovingly arranged. An upright piano occupied one corner of the room, and guitars of different sizes hung on the wall. "You know, Mr. Edward," continued Mrs. Constance, her voice soft but firm, "these children don't have much in terms of material things, but they have something very precious, the love for music and art that Clara Marie planted in their hearts. Lucas grew up here within these walls, learning that true wealth lies in people, in the stories we share, in the music we make together." Edward felt the weight of those words. He looked out the window and saw Lucas in the courtyard, already surrounded by friends, taking the guitar out of its case. The smile on his face, the way his eyes sparkled just being there, it was something no amount of money in the world could buy. "The project needs support to keep going," said Mrs. Constance gently. "Helen always managed to keep everything running with great effort and dedication, but now that she's in Portugal—" "How much?" interrupted Edward, his voice steady. "How much do you need to keep the project running, to expand, to bring in more teachers, more instruments?" The director blinked, surprised by the determination in his voice. But before she could respond, the sound of music began to fill the air. In the courtyard, Lucas and his friends had started to play, their young voices joining together in a song that spoke of hope and dreams. The following weeks brought significant changes to both the little school and the Thompson mansion. Edward, driven by a determination that had surprised even his closest associates, had created a foundation to manage and expand the Music for All project. The old music room at the school underwent a complete renovation, and new instruments arrived weekly. But the greatest transformation wasn't in the freshly painted walls or the new equipment, it was in the people. Edward, who had once dedicated every moment to his business, now rearranged his schedule to attend the children's musical performances. His important meetings had to fit around Lucas's rehearsal times. On a particularly meaningful afternoon, the little school held its first performance after the changes. The courtyard had been transformed into a small outdoor auditorium, with chairs arranged in a semicircle and an improvised stage decorated with flowers and colorful ribbons. "Dad, are you sure you'll be able to stay until the end?" asked Lucas, tuning the strings of his guitar backstage. His face showed a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Edward, who had cancelled a video conference with Chinese investors to be there, smiled confidently. "I wouldn't miss your performance for anything in the world, son." Mrs. Clara, who had insisted on coming to watch, handed out pieces of cornmeal cake among the other children, already completely at ease in this environment so different from the mansion. She watched with pride as her employer had changed, as his eyes now held a sparkle that money had never been able to provide. The performance began with a presentation by the children's choir, now conducted by Professor Beatrice, a young musician Edward had hired to continue the work of Clara Marie. The children's voices rose into the afternoon air, singing of hope and dreams, causing more than one person in the audience to discreetly wipe away tears. Among those present was Father Michael, who watched everything with a serene smile. He remembered well that Sunday morning when a boy had interrupted his Mass, setting off a chain of events that were now transforming an entire community. The most anticipated moment of the afternoon arrived when Lucas took the stage with his group. They had prepared a special arrangement, blending classical music with popular Brazilian rhythms. The boy, once so shy, now radiated confidence as his fingers danced across the guitar strings. Edward, seated in the front row, felt his heart beat faster with every note. In Lucas's music, he could hear echoes of Clara Marie, of his own mother, of all the musical memories he had tried to bury over the years. But now those memories no longer brought pain. They brought a sweet nostalgia and the certainty that life had given him a second chance. During the performance, Mrs. Constance discreetly approached Edward. "You know, Mr. Edward, Clara Marie always said that music has the power to heal souls. Look around you. See how many lives are being transformed." It was true. The project wasn't just teaching music to the children. It was building bridges between different worlds, bringing together people who might never have met otherwise. The business people Edward had invited to learn about the project were chatting animatedly with the neighborhood residents, discovering they had more in common than they had imagined. After the performance, as people gathered for a community snack, Lucas took Edward by the hand and led him to a quieter corner of the courtyard. There he pulled out a slightly crumpled envelope from his pocket. "Aunt Helen sent this letter from Portugal," he said, handing the envelope to his father. "She said there are a few more things you need to know about Mom." Edward took the envelope with slightly trembling hands. The paper carried the same soft fragrance he remembered from the office years ago, when Clara Marie still worked with him. That scent brought back memories he had buried deep in his mind, but now he had to face them. That night, after returning from the performance, Edward sat in his library with Helen's letter in hand. Lucas had already gone to bed, exhausted but happy after the success of the show. The silence of the night was broken only by the ticking of the old clock and the occasional rustle of pages, as Edward finally mustered the courage to open the envelope. "Dear Edward," the letter began, Helen's elegant handwriting filling the page. "I write from Lisbon, where the sound of church bells reminds me so much of our little church in Brooklyn. I know Lucas is with you now, and I can only imagine how many discoveries and changes this has brought to your life." Edward adjusted himself in the leather armchair, preparing for what was to come. "There is something Clara Marie never had the courage to tell you, not even in the pages of the diary Lucas gave you. Something she kept in her heart until her final moments. In truth, she never stopped loving you, Edward. Even after all these years, even knowing that you would follow different paths." The words hit Edward like gentle waves, bringing to the surface memories he had tried to bury in the ocean of forgetfulness. "Do you remember that company New Year's party, just a few months before she left? Clara Marie was wearing a blue dress, and you danced to a song, The Girl from Ipanema, the piano version. She told me that in that moment, looking into your eyes, she almost revealed everything. About the pregnancy, about the feelings she kept hidden, about the dreams she had quietly built." Edward closed his eyes, and the memory of that night came back vividly in his mind. The soft scent of Clara Marie, the way she smiled as they danced, something in her eyes that he couldn't decipher at the time. Now, 15 years later, that moment took on a new meaning. But Clara Marie was like that. always thinking of others before herself. She knew you were about to close the biggest deal of your life, that your marriage to Beatrice was a crucial part of those plans. So she chose to step away, carrying not only our Lucas, but also all the dreams she had built by your side. A solitary tear rolled down Edward's face, falling onto the paper. Yet she never allowed Lucas to grow up with any bitterness or resentment. On the contrary, she made sure he knew that his father was a good man, someone she admired for his determination and principles. The stories she told to help Lucas fall asleep often had you as the hero, even if he didn't know it at the time. The letter continued, revealing small details that Clara Marie had shared only with her sister over the years. How she discreetly followed Edward's success through the newspapers, how she smiled when she recognized in Lucas some gestures so characteristic of his father, how she kept the only photo they had together, taken during a company lunch, safely stored away. In her final days, when the illness had already taken much of her strength, Clara Marie made me promise that I would find a way to bring you and Lucas together, not out of obligation or guilt, but because she believed that the two of you needed each other. The Edward I knew, she told me, has a huge heart that he himself doesn't even realize, and Lucas has so much love to give. They can help each other become better people. Edward had to pause reading. He stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the moonlight bathing the garden. In the next room, he could hear the soft sound of a guitar, Lucas practicing quietly as he did every night before bed. Now, Edward, I need to tell you the real reason for this letter. Among Clara Marie's belongings, I found something I believe you should have. It's a composition, a piece of music she wrote for you and Lucas, but never had the chance to share. It's attached to this letter. Clara Marie called it Symphony of Reunion. With trembling hands, Edward picked up the second sheet from the envelope. There, carefully handwritten, were musical notes with lyrics and melody in a script he knew so well. It was a simple yet deeply emotional tune speaking of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Sunday dawned with a different light at St. Mary's Church. Exactly 3 months after that morning that changed everything, the church pews were once again filled. This time, however, it wasn't for a regular mass. It was for a special performance by the Music for All project. The altar had been transformed into a small stage where a grand piano, the same one that had sat silent for years in the Thompson mansion, now took center stage. Beside it, chairs arranged in a semicircle awaited the young musicians who would soon perform. Edward, seated in the front pew, held the concert program in his hands. The title of the event, Symphony of Reunion, made his heart beat faster. Lucas was backstage, tuning his guitar and organizing sheet music with the other students from the project. Father Michael opened the ceremony with words that deeply moved those present. Sometimes God writes straight with lines that seem crooked to us. 3 months ago, a young boy interrupted our mass, bringing not a disturbance but a miracle disguised as coincidence. Mrs. Clara, sitting beside Edward, held a handkerchief with which she occasionally dabbed her eyes. Mrs. Constance, in the row behind, smiled serenely. The church was filled with residents of Brooklyn, business people and friends of the project, all united by the music and the story unfolding before them. The first part of the concert unfolded magnificently. The students from the project presented a repertoire that blended classical and popular music, showcasing all the talent that Clara Marie had helped awaken and that now flourished under the care of the new teachers. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Lucas stood up and walked to the center of the altar. Edward noticed he was wearing a blue shirt, the same color as the dress Clara Marie had worn on that dance night so many years ago. This final piece, Lucas began, his youthful but firm voice echoing through the church, is very special. It was written by my mother, Clara Marie, for two people she loved more than anything in the world. Today, for the first time, it will be played in public. Edward felt his heart skip a beat as Lucas continued, and I would like to invite my father to play with me. A murmur of surprise and emotion swept through the church. Edward had told no one, not even Lucas, that in recent weeks he had resumed his piano lessons, secretly practicing the melody Clara Marie had composed. With slow but determined steps, Edward walked to the piano. He sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked at his son. Lucas smiled, that same smile he had inherited from Clara Marie, and began to play the first chords on the guitar. The melody, born from the meeting of piano and guitar, was breathtakingly beautiful. It was a song that spoke of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. In the high notes of the piano, Edward expressed all the longing and regret he had carried for years. In the strings of Lucas's guitar echoed the hope and unconditional love that Clara Marie had planted in his heart. The symphony of reunion filled every corner of the church, touching every heart present. Some people wept openly, others smiled, with teary eyes. Father Michael at his altar clasped his hands in a silent prayer of gratitude. When the final note rang out, the silence that followed was almost sacred. It was broken only when Lucas, setting his guitar aside, crossed the small space that separated him from his father and embraced him. Edward wrapped his son in his arms, and in that moment, all words were unnecessary. From Portugal, Helen watched everything through a video call that Mrs. Constance discreetly streamed on her phone. Her tears, even from across the ocean, joined those of everyone present. The Music for All project had become much more than a social program. It was now an extended family, where stories of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings were composed daily. The little school in Brooklyn had become a meeting point between different worlds, proving that music, as Clara Marie had always said, truly had the power to unite hearts. Edward Thompson, the businessman who once lived only for work, now presided over the Clara Marie Arts Foundation, ensuring that the project reached more and more children. But his greatest pride was not in the numbers or the accolades. It was in the simple moments, like when he and Lucas played together on the piano in the mansion, or when they shared stories over breakfast. The symphony of reunion had become more than a piece of music. It had transformed into a symbol of how love, even when it seems lost, always finds its way back. And on Sunday mornings, when the bells of St. Mary's Church called the faithful to Mass, father and son would sit on the same pews where it all began, silently giving thanks for the miracle of new beginnings.